pleasure to be back here with World Affairs Council. The programming which the WAC does is extraordinary. This is one of the most active chapters of World Affairs Councils that I have ever worked with. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be here with all of you. And I'm delighted that you're actually running a summer camp for would-be diplomats. I hope you don't allow electronics, just like other southern summer camps do, and focus on personal exchanges and experiences there. But all best to all of you, especially the students in the audience. In October, I was minding my own business on the road up to Oil City, Pennsylvania. For those of you who don't know where that is, you have a reason not to. It is the site of the Drake Well, the first producing oil well in the United States. I was going there for a hydrocarbon-related conference when I got a call from the Operations Center at the State Department that said, "Secretary wants to talk to you." Well, the secretary, I pulled over, the secretary did talk to me and asked me, this was 5 days after the events of October 7th, if I could take on the job of Presidential Envoy for Middle East Humanitarian Issues, meaning Gaza. I asked him when. He said immediately. And he said, "The President's going to be calling you shortly to ask." As well, which he did. I said that I would have to consult on all of this. So I talked to the two most important persons that I needed to speak to. First, Jim Baker, who was on the way to his ranch. The secretary said, "You've got to do it. It's good for the country. It's good for the Institute. It's a responsibility you can't say no to." The next person was Reggie DeRoche, the president of Rice, who made the same remarks. Having gotten the okay from them, I called my wife, who is a Foreign Service officer, and explained to her what was about to happen. She is reconciled to all of this, and I said, I think I'll be home by Christmas. Well, 8 months later, with the expiration of my statutorily limited presidential appointment, I did come home. But I want to talk to you tonight about the what. The what happened, the what it meant, what we have and have not been able to achieve in terms of addressing this crisis, and why it matters. Why it matters for America, why it matters for the region, why it matters for Texas, for Houston. Because all of that's important. This isn't an abstract issue focused upon by the punditry as it is. It's an issue whose resolution or inability to resolve has an impact, a real impact here in the United States and for our friends and partners around the world. On October 7th, Yahya Sinwar, the de facto military leader of Hamas, a U.S. recognized foreign terrorist organization, launched an attack on Israel. The attack was intended to do two things: shock and awe, not just Israel, but the Arab world, the world at large, to reinforce the stature of Hamas and how important it was, indeed beyond important, that it was the leader of the Palestinian movement and the resistance. It was to take hostages with whom he would bargain for release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, as had been the time-honored practice in this conflict over the last 16 years. And he believed to trigger what he thought, confidently assessed, would be an Iranian war on Israel, Iran and Hezbollah, an uprising throughout the Arab world to challenge Israel, the United States, Israel's other supporters, and those Arab governments which had normalized relationships with Israel. That's what Sinwar expected would happen. Now, with respect to the events of October 7th, he succeeded beyond his expectations. It was the greatest massacre, murder of Jews since the camps were liberated in 1945. 200 plus hostages were taken back into Gaza. It was the greatest single shock to the Israeli security system, to Israel as a society and a people since the establishment of the state and the armistice in 49. 67, 73, these were campaigns states on state. Serious and significant as they were, they paled in comparison to the trauma of October 7th. And it is not a trauma that was time limited, any more than 9/11 was time limited to that day or that week or that month or that year. In many ways, it is with us still. In Israel, where I spent almost all of the last 8 months, it is always October 7th. It is psychological, it is social. 120,000 Israelis are displaced from their homes, not just around Gaza, where their communities were destroyed, but from the north, where although Iran did not, thankfully, do what Sinwar thought they would, they froze on October 7th, shocked by what had happened. I'm speaking of Tehran. They didn't know what this was. Was this an act which Sinwar calculated would bring them in, but Israel would then use as a justification to attack Iran and then bring us, the U.S., into the war? They couldn't be sure. So they held their hand. Then they decided, we can't be completely silent, but we certainly aren't going to go to war with Israel. We don't want that. We'll have Hezbollah symbolically attack. We'll have the Houthis somewhat more than symbolically attack the Yemeni militia, which Iran has backed and supplied with advanced weaponry for so many years now. We'll deal through proxies with all of this, but we won't go to war ourselves. Now that decision by Iran was a critical factor then, and it remains a critical factor today, because it is what has stopped this crisis from becoming a regional crisis, with implications far beyond Israel and Gaza. But let's go back to the immediate situation. President Biden traveled to Israel on October 18th. When the president came, he had two messages. I was there with him. The messages were both private and public. Pretty much the same thing. They were twofold. The United States supports you. We have your back, was his message to Israel. We will help you with what you need to ensure that Hamas is never again able to conduct an attack, a massacre, as they did on October 7th. And we will help you to try to assure that Hamas is not able to continue to govern Gaza. Because we don't want either of two situations to be the day after Israel is in de facto occupation of Gaza, or Hamas remains in de facto control. We'll look for another way. The president said, while you have Israel, not just every right, but every obligation to respond to this brutality, any state with the capacity to do so would, you've got another obligation. This is going to be a hard fight. It's going to be complex. And you're going to need time, and you're going to need space, political space, and support in which to conduct it. And for you to have that time and space, you have got to pursue, you've got to facilitate as aggressive a humanitarian pillar of this campaign as your kinetic military pillar. You can't do one without the other. Humanitarian alone, without a military campaign against Hamas, won't achieve the outcomes we want. And the reverse is true as well. It cannot just be a military security-oriented campaign. Got to do them both. Well, that was the message on October 18th and 19th. What did we hear at the time? Not one drop of fuel, not one drop of water, not 1 ounce of food will enter Gaza until the hostages are released. Well, that was not a tenable position. On October 21st, the first trucks of food began to move. 20. Hard-fought battle, 20 tries. Took the President of the United States engaging to get it to move. And for the 5 or 6 months that followed that, until March, the struggle to get food in enough to prevent famine, enough to prevent technical starvation, not enough to address malnutrition, not enough to address wasting, not enough to address mortality and morbidity in vulnerable populations, nursing mothers, pregnant mothers, newborns, infants, young children, but enough to avoid famine. That's where we were focused. And with every passing week, we were able to do more. And if you believe the progress that was made was either insignificant or would have been accomplished without the leadership of the United States, that's a mistake. It was our leadership every day, every night. And the leadership included our extraordinary ambassador to Israel, former Treasury Secretary, OMB Director twice, White House Chief of Staff Jack Lew, one of the most exceptional public servants I have ever worked with. It was at the White House, Jake Sullivan, at the State Department, Tony Blinken, and it was the President. It was the President late at night making phone calls, the President hammering home points on what we needed to see, what we didn't want to see. When Jack Lew and I reflected on the unique arcs of our career, that at this late stage in our lives, we were acting as truck marshalers. We took solace at 4 a.m. in the morning, which is often when these conversations took place in Israel, with the fact that the President of the United States was doing the same thing we were. Why? Because it was essential. Because the time and space needed to pursue the strategic campaign against Hamas for a different day after required all of this effort on the humanitarian side. It was also morally the right thing to do, and let's never lose sight of that. It was strategically critical. It was also, from a standpoint of values, the right thing to do, and that's something that needs to be reinforced constantly. We can't just instrumentalize these things. There's right and there's wrong here. This was right. We were able, by dint of our efforts, our leadership, our constant, Tony Blinken has been to the Middle East either 9 or 10 times now. Jake Sullivan, multiple times. The President has been on the phone very, very often. And not just with the leadership of Israel, but with all of the states in the Arab world to try to advance these goals. We're not alone here. What Hamas did, this traumatizing shock to Israel, was a shock to Arab states as well. They don't wish to see a victorious Hamas. That would be a threat of strategic character to them. Hamas acted when it did for several reasons. It was an Israeli holiday, the last day of Simchat Torah. It was a moment when Hamas felt preparations had been done well in advance, so they thought they could get through the fence into Israel and get back successfully. They had done all of the work they needed to do. But they wanted to act precisely when they did in order to thwart the possibility of a Saudi-Israeli normalization. And with it, another blow to the so-called axis of resistance, another demonstration that the Palestinian cause was not the dominant motivator, driver of Arab politics, and to avoid another blow to Iran and Iran's ability to instrumentalize issues in the Middle East to threaten the Gulf, and through the Gulf to threaten the West. That's why they acted. Arab states are keenly aware of all of this. The Arab world does not wish to see this conflict, this crisis end in a manner which allows Sinwar and Hamas to say they're victorious. But herein lies the dilemma, the challenge. For Israel to win, they must be victorious. For Hamas to win asymmetrical warfare, they just have to survive. The original goal of Sinwar, to precipitate this Iranian war on Israel, a broader Arab street uprising, failed. The Arab streets had been calm. There's a lot of anti-American sentiment, but it's taken out on American franchisees, not on Americans. The oil market, the hydrocarbon markets have remained absolutely calm through all of this. Absolutely calm. Little blips, but very small and very quickly passed. None of the fundamental drivers of policy and behaviors, economic or social, in the region have changed as a result of this yet. Because right now, the balance is still out there. Can Israel manage to achieve its strategic objectives vis-a-vis Hamas? What's complicated about doing that? Israel is a very powerful armed forces. They have our backing and support. What's the problem here? The problem is no army in the world today has fought a campaign like this in circumstances like this. No one. Not us, not Israel, not anyone in NATO. This is a campaign above ground and below ground. 16 years of preparation by Hamas. Millions and millions of dollars invested in the military infrastructure, which permitted not just the attack on October 7th, but the resiliency with which Hamas has survived as a military entity in the face of virtually everything the IDF can do. 300 miles, that's an estimate, of tunnels. Miles. And this isn't Great Escape, spoon-carved tunnels. These are massively reinforced, very deep tunnels beyond the range of most weapon systems to reach. You go into a building, Hamas comes out and fights, they vanish again. Humanitarian infrastructure, schools, hospitals, shelters, used over these years as perceived cover. Cover in two ways. Either Israel wouldn't attack these places, knowing what they were, which was good, because then you were safe, or it would attack, and it would kill as many civilians as possible. And that was even better for you, because that furthered your campaign of driving away international support from Israel. This is why this fight is as difficult as it is. Israel has killed, taken off the battlefield, a very large number of Hamas's fighters. But these aren't terrorist gang members. It's a terrorist army, 30,000 strong, heavily armed, very well disciplined, very well structured. Breaking it above ground, below ground, is a massive challenge. And what happens when Israel does campaign to the maximum extent it can, as it has done in North Gaza, Khan Yunis in the center, is doing now in Rafah in the south? When the ground campaign comes to an end, as it did in those first two places, as it will in the next week or two or three in Rafah, the moment the IDF is gone, Hamas comes back. It comes back, it asserts control, it asserts dominance, it fires rockets again. It displays not just its civil authority, but its military power as well. And Israel comes back in over and over again. The Hamas strategy is now and has been, since those first weeks in October, to attrit, to exhaust, to drive away support from Israel in the U.S., in Europe, around the world. Just as Putin couldn't defeat Ukraine in the 3 weeks he assumed he would require to completely seize the country, and switch to an attrition campaign to attrip the structures of the state in Ukraine, but more importantly, to exhaust and wear out the rest of the world, whose attention would move on to other things, whose politics would be focused on other issues than Ukraine over time. Sinwar has very much the same strategy towards Israel. So what are we doing? What is the U.S. doing? We are focused laser-like on two issues. The first is maximizing the degree of humanitarian assistance, targeted assistance, the right kinds of assistance into Gaza. That's where we've been since October. By the beginning of May, we were at a point where we were about to stop counting trucks and start working with key NGOs and UN institutions to get specialized feeding, specialized care into targeted populations. We've never been able to do enough. We're very open about that. President, Secretary of State Jake Sullivan. But we wanted and we saw the opportunity in the beginning of May, just 5 weeks ago, to go beyond raw counts of truckloads moved, because we were moving hundreds of trucks every day into the north, into the south, into the center. We had gotten the opening of 2 new passages into the north, Erez and Sikkim, a central corridor passage open. We had increased dramatically the functionality of Kerem Shalom. That's the big inspection crossing point in the south of Gaza. There were more truckloads of goods moving into Gaza than there were contractable trucks in Gaza to pick up and to distribute. And we were in the less unhappy place, I will never use the term happier, the less unhappy place of focusing on getting more truck bodies into Gaza to pick up the assistance that was there on the ground and move it. With the Rafah campaign, which we cautioned Israel against doing without suitable preparations, all of that dropped. First to 0, and now 5 weeks, going on 6 into Rafah. The level of aid being distributed in Gaza is still a fraction of what it was before. That was a big setback. Only now, in these last days, is Israel beginning to take the measures they told us they needed to take before the operation began. Well, the operation's been underway. 1 million people have left Rafah, as we confidently expected they would. And they have not gone to areas where they have adequate shelter, sanitation, medical care available to them. They didn't in Rafah before they left. They are in an even worse situation now. And it is why, to bring this all to today, the President, all of us have focused on the necessity of 2 things, and they have to exist as 2 sides of the same understanding. Release of hostages, ceasefire. Ceasefire, release of hostages. You don't get one without the other. With a ceasefire, which we believe can be of enduring character, you will have a far greater ability to distribute the very large quantities of assistance that exist right now inside Gaza but cannot be moved. You'll have a better ability to move humanitarian staff in and out of Gaza. Rafah Terminal will reopen. Rafah closed on 7th of May with the initiation of this fight. A ceasefire is vital. And a ceasefire does something else as well. A ceasefire in Gaza, we believe, will mean a ceasefire on the northern front with Hezbollah. And that's very important. Because, as I noted, there is no Iranian or Hezbollah intent to have a war with Israel. But with every exchange that goes on, and those exchanges are almost hourly, Hezbollah rockets northern Israel, sends drones over, Israel responds. So every day that goes by, the risk, not of intent, But misadventure, mistake, miscalculation grows greater. Something happens that wasn't planned, wasn't intended. And then there's a response to it. And that doesn't produce the response that was anticipated. And then you have a very, very different situation on your hand, which is why my colleague, as Special Envoy Hans Hochstein, is in Lebanon today, having been in Israel yesterday, working these issues to try to see if a political, diplomatic resolution that addresses the North can be done. But the real way to bring that front to quiet soonest is a ceasefire in Gaza. Who bears responsibility for the fact that, as we talk, there isn't a ceasefire? One party, Hamas. Israel proposed a deal, an arrangement which we believe was extraordinarily forthcoming, flexible, positive, put whatever adjective you want on it. It reflected in many ways positions Hamas had asked for in previous rounds of negotiations. But after over 10 days of silence, when Hamas finally responded, it was with a new set of proposals. And I can't use better language than Tony Blinken's from about 5 days ago, at a point, and we're getting there, at a point reasonable people will have to draw a conclusion that there is no interest in concluding a ceasefire. We will continue every effort we can to see that a ceasefire takes place. We're not giving up because the stakes are far too high for the hostages, for the families of those who've been lost. There are 5 Americans taken hostage in Gaza that we have to be concerned about as a primary reason beyond the general hostage population. The suffering needs to end. This war needs to stop. But Hamas has to agree. And whether they will or not is an open question. I have my own views, which are not particularly hopeful on this score, but that can't affect our willingness and the necessity, the obligation we have to try to pursue every possible resolution. Now, I'll kind of wrap all of this in a how does this end? 3 end states for Gaza. Well, I'll give you 4. The first 3 aren't good. Israeli de facto occupation. It's not desirable. I'm not even sure it's politically possible in Israel. Second, Somalia, kind of a term of loose art. Chaos, suffering, radicalization, Hobbesian situation on the ground, a Gaza dependent entirely on international feeding. Third, Hamas regains de facto control, kind of like it was. Not with the ability to do what they did on October 7th, not yet, although they have declared when they have the capacity to, they will do it again and again and again because it is in their nature to do so. That's not acceptable. Or a day after, which over time, with broad international and Palestinian participation, offers a different horizon for Gaza and for the 2.2 million Gazan population. But to get to that day after, you need to have a day before which does not have Hamas in a position, passively or actively, to deny stabilization, a new security environment, or to dictate the terms of reconstruction. There aren't going to be very many Arab states willing to put shoes or boots into Gaza if they believe they are either facilitating Hamas as a de facto authority or presenting themselves as opponents to Hamas. And there are going to be very few dollars or dinars or rials for reconstruction if Hamas is seen as the effective beneficiary for 2 reasons. Because the international community does not want to reward Hamas for what has happened. And secondly, very pragmatic, they know Israel will strike and will address the threat Hamas poses, and infrastructure will be destroyed again. It is harder for me tonight to come work the calculus to a resolution set other than one of those dismal three options than it has been at any point in the 45 years I have been working this and related issues. This is hugely hard, very hard. It is a situation built over many, many years of Hamas calculated investment in its military, in the infrastructure, in dominance, and a conventional armed force, however competent in Israel, facing an asymmetrical challenge like nothing we faced in Mosul, Second Fallujah, or any of the campaigns in Syria or Iraq. Really, really hard. Why does it matter? It matters because instability in the Middle East, no matter what the source, will be instrumentalized by Iran as a regional actor, by China, the PRC, as an external actor. Russia plays on the margins of all of this, but I can't put them in the top two. This is about Iran, it's about China. They will take advantage of all of this. Why are we so intent on pursuing a deal with Saudi Arabia? Is it because we want to see as the all-encompassing goal normalization with Israel? That's a very important achievement. I don't diminish it in the least. It's de-risking. It's de-risking Saudi and Gulf infrastructure from Iranian threat by posing a credible U.S.-Saudi alliance against Iran. And if you think Tehran doesn't pay attention, you're wrong. They're very concerned this will be an outcome. It's about China, because Saudi Arabia will be constrained in its own behaviors as part of the deal with respect to the PRC. That's strategically important for the United States. But you can't get to those strategic goals without now having to address this crisis in Gaza. Because there's going to be two requirements posed by Saudi Arabia. Broadly speaking, one is that the level of fighting go down. Second, that there is an articulated by the government of Israel credible pathway to a two-state resolution. That is an extraordinarily hard goal for this coalition to agree to. But there's a big prize out there. And the prize is both normalization, a confrontation or a pushback, a deterrence on Iran, and part of an ongoing strategic reset of the Middle East. Hamas represents an older Middle East. Saudi deal is the newer, different Middle East. But the choices now aren't entirely in Israeli hands, or Saudi hands, or ours. And I guess that's my absolute final remark. So why don't we just make it all work? It must be because we're not doing something. It must be because we're doing something, but it's the wrong something. Folks, 23 years after 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, we don't control the fall of every sparrow, as the expression goes. This conflict right now is perceived as existential by Hamas, to their interests, existential to Israeli interests. It is really hard for the most powerful external actors to engage successfully in existential conflict. Tough lesson, hard lesson. Must be the fault of the president. Must be the fault of the military. Somebody's to blame. No, it's the nature of the situation we confront, the strategic calculus on the part of the parties. We do what we can, we and our partners, to shape this, to mitigate harm. But at the end of the day, I use the same phrase, it is really, really hard, and it really, really matters. With that, happy to take your questions.
You might have heard from Marianne's introduction. He only finished this position just a few weeks ago in May. And I'd also like to say, a lot of you already do it, but if not, look at Baker Institute. It's an incredible organization, a policy institute that put a great array of experts and analysts, yourself included, at the top of that mountain. And you also do wonderful programs, similar to the council, just to help all of us get a better idea of what's going on in the world. And they also have a great array, stable of experts in place.
But before you go on, I'll make a shameless pitch. We are very, very enthusiastic about seeing you all at our events as well. For those of you who are interested in supporting us or who want to go see our events and then contemplate supporting us, we have a roundtable with even more events available to you. So I don't want to switch you away from support for the World Affairs Council, but consider us as another source of informed dialogue, events, and speakers. Happy to have you.
And just to kind of, play a bit of devil's advocate, you mentioned 9/11, Afghanistan in particular, Iraq indirectly. That was absolutely what Osama bin Laden wanted. The debate within was with Al Qaeda was the far enemy, the near enemy. Osama bin Laden, we want the United States involved. We want to bring them in militarily. He got the war he wanted. It was just what he wanted, and it spread beyond the Middle East, a blowout and back and forth for it. What's your perspective with regards to Hamas and Sinwar in particular, the military leader of Hamas? And people would say, his own words, he said, we only make headlines with blood. When it comes to civilian sacrifices, including Palestinians, they are necessary, they're acceptable. That to a degree, any country would have had a major and intense lethal response to October 7th. But some people, including some of Israel's potential allies, would say, it has been so extreme, it has been so dire, there have been so many thousands of Palestinians killed. Are you just playing right into exactly what Hamas wants?
Well, look, there are really two questions embedded here. Does Sinwar hope that the necessity, and it is a necessity, of collateral civilian deaths, suffering, in order to get at his own terrorist forces, that this will, over time, the images relentlessly played, and not just by Al Jazeera, which has been shameless in this regard, but also by BBC, by other international media. Does he hope that this will attrit the willingness of the world to support Israel? Of course he does. Does he think he will survive this? Yeah, I think he does. I don't think he wants to be a martyr. He wants to be a survivor. He wants to lead the resistance way beyond Gaza. Recall something. And this is not a judgment that emerged after October 7th. This has always been our judgment. Hamas doesn't give a damn about Gaza. Gaza, this miserable little strip of territory, Gaza's an instrumentality, always has been. Gaza's the tool that gets you to the real prize. The real prize is Ramallah. It's the West Bank. It's the PLO. It's the Palestinian Authority. It is the final overtaking of Oslo, 31 years on, by Hamas, and the complete displacement of Fatah. That's the prize. And then from there, the Arab street more broadly outside the West Bank. So will Sinwar sacrifice or allow to be sacrificed anyone, anywhere to achieve his goals? Of course he will. Absolutely he will. Has Israel been reckless in the conduct of this campaign? This is a tough one, Ronan. More or less, the broad Israeli assumption is that at this point in the campaign, the ratio of Hamas killed to civilians is somewhere around 1-to-1. They'll acknowledge it could be slightly higher for civilians, but this is a ratio that, globally speaking, isn't all that bad. It's a tragedy, and I cannot and will not diminish. Every death is a gut kick, Tony Blinken's words. Children, women, innocents. But who's responsible for this? It's Hamas. And they did it in a calculated manner. They assumed this would be the case, and they assumed that it would ultimately drive away the ability within Israel and outside Israel to pursue this campaign to completion. That was their judgment.
And obviously, this could take an entire hour, but just in terms of the future leadership this next few years for Israel, for Palestinians, whether it be in the West Bank or Gaza, most people would say we have poor or extreme or terrorist leadership in terms of Hamas in all three capacities. Fatah in the West Bank, obviously corrupt, very inefficient. Their president makes our candidates right now look like teenagers. He's almost 90. And then in Israel, Netanyahu was the most popular he'd ever been. The largest protests in the street against him, people saw it trying to take too much power over the judiciary. That the war almost was a lifeline for him, that it's something that allows him to keep hanging on. His most prominent centrist minister, Benny Gantz, just left the war cabinet a few days ago, and he said one of the primary reasons was, what is the end game? We talked about Petraeus in Iraq. What is the day after? What is the plan for Gaza beyond just retribution? Where do you see the leadership of both sides?
It's really, really hard to repeat that. And look, I'm not going to comment on the internal political processes in Israel, except to note that the constraints this coalition and the more radical hardline members impose upon the government make it difficult, if not impossible, to accept a role for the PA as the PA in Gaza. Our position is without the PA in Gaza as a simple, practical reality. You can't create imaginary Palestinians, unicorns, as they're sometimes referred to, who somehow will have no connection to the PA, but will be able to effectively administer even Rafah Terminal. Just the micro issue of Rafah Terminal. Who's going to run it? Israel isn't going to run it. Egypt's not going to come across the border and run it. It's going to have to be a Palestinian. Who do they belong to? They belong to the PA. But this coalition cannot accept that point. It would be hard enough if you had a very different government in Israel. And here I'll make a point that I think has been ill-reflected in the chattering classes. Were the government of Israel tonight to accept that credible pathway to a two-state resolution, would it affect the situation on the ground in Gaza? No. Hamas has had 31 years to accept a credible pathway to a two-state resolution that did not involve violence. And it has rejected it, not as a tactic, but because it isn't who they are. They are a very different thing entirely from even the dysfunctional PLO of 1993. They're the ones responsible for this, while you must hold out that political horizon of a two-state resolution. It's very important. It's critical. Do I believe acceptance of that by the government of Israel alone would be determinative on the course of events on the ground? No. Over time, it could have an impact. But in the immediate future, it is dealing with the reality of Hamas and Hamas presence and Hamas ability, passively or actively, to exert control.
And just a quick follow-up to that. Hamas, horrific terrorist organization. I am not at all supportive of it. As we discussed earlier, the only place in the Arab world where its approval ratings have gone down is in Gaza, where they live with it and suffer from it. But it's gone up in much of the Middle East. It's gone up in the West Bank. And it's not because those people approve of the killing, approve of what's happening. It's some would say they approve of the fact that the Palestinian issue has been brought back to the fore. Do you think the fact that it has not been dealt with by most of the Arab nations in the region and kind of not discussed by Israelis as well as part of what created this powder keg?
Look, Ronan, I go back to the fundamental point I just made. Hamas has had 31 years to accept what we used to call the Oslo principles. Eschew violence and terror. political negotiations. They rejected it. They rejected it when Yitzhak Rabin was prime minister, 93 to 95, when there was a real possibility, I think more than a possibility, of achieving a two-state resolution. They didn't want any part of it then. They don't want any part of it now. Would a more aggressive pursuit of a realistic political horizon in the West Bank have provided a counter model to Gaza? Yeah. And that's a policy we advocated for many years after Ariel Sharon's unilateral withdrawal in 2005 from Gaza. Provide another example, another model. Do it in the West Bank. It didn't happen. But that statement in no way serves as a justification for or explanation of the brutality, the massacre of October 7th. It has no justification.
I always like to have great student questions. Dario asks, how have recent protests across our college campuses affected the nature of American aid and the potential for and terms for a ceasefire? What has been the broader impact of the protests?
Because the administration has been tireless, literally tireless, in pursuit of a ceasefire, of hostage returns as part of the ceasefire, and of the delivery of the maximum amount of humanitarian assistance. I have to tell you, those protests have not had an impact on policies that were already in place. I have my own reaction, having viewed them from overseas. And while I understand that many of those involved in the protests did so out of genuine conviction and concern on what they perceived to be the injustices of what is happening, and for that is entirely their right, if not their complete freedom. And while I also appreciate a certain amount of this is let's see what we can get away with at the end of the semester. In my day, it was tear gas and seizure of administration buildings. 71 and 72 Springs loom largely in my mind in this regard over a different issue. There was a sour, venomous strain of anti-Semitism, or to say the words which aren't polite, Jew hatred in all of this. And that's not just the product of the actual students on those actual campuses. It is groups that have a far broader agenda and a far broader reach who have nothing to do with those students or those campuses.
Okay, and just you mentioned obviously, the intense efforts the Biden administration has had, since October 7th, and you've been a huge part of that. Adalton, another great student from Audio National School, asks, how do you think the management of the situation would differ if Trump wins the presidency?
I literally cannot. I can offer no meaningful comment on that question.
Right.
I have no clue. I don't know. I have no idea. Okay. I wish I could respond. I have no idea.
Okay. Brian asked just a kind of more regional question. How has this basically impacted Iranian relations, say, with the region overall? You discussed, obviously, Hamas was, doing this with the hopes to have Iran get involved. What's Iran's role in the region? Has it surprised you that they have not been as involved as they were?
No. The Iranian regime is not risk-taking, nor is it suicidal. They've got their own domestic challenges, significant domestic challenges. They were not about to buy onto a conflict they did not have a hand in preparing and for which they were not prepared. Not when they thought it could well be a trap to provide a pretext, a justification for either Israel or through Israel us to strike. It's why we sent the two carrier groups to the Eastern Med and to the Gulf in order to send the signal to Iran, as President Biden said when he was in Israel, don't take advantage of this situation. And again, If we were in a situation of a broader conflict or war in the north of Israel, in Lebanon, with Iran, this would be vastly more complex, more lethal, and much more devastating for all the parties involved. It is not a matter of intent to have a war. Not by Israel, not by Hezbollah, not by Iran. It's miscalculation.
And related to the regional players, and especially these two in particular, you're doing very well. Samuel asks, can you discuss the situation with regards to U.S. partners in the region and their status on it, and in particular Egypt and Jordan? And maybe you could mention the Qataris too.
Yeah, we have been heavily engaged throughout all of this with key partners in the region. Egypt, Jordan, who are directly affected by what happens in Gaza. In the case of Egypt, immediately affected by whether or not there is an outflow of Palestinians from Gaza across the border, on whether or not Rafah, which is an internationally recognized border crossing, reopens again or not. Jordan, because of the impact politically on their majority Palestinian population of events taking place in Gaza and in the West Bank, where the situation has not been quiet, has not been stable. And then with the Gulf, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the Qataris. The Emiratis have been very engaged on humanitarian relief efforts, medical and non-medical. Qatar, along with Egypt, has been one of the two critical partners in the messaging, for us and for Israel, in the messaging that goes on with respect to Hamas on the hostage issue, on the ceasefire deals. They have played a vital, irreplaceable role, both of them. And I will note here, in what seems at times like an irredeemably dark picture, what hasn't changed? The Saudis want that deal, which includes normalization with Israel, as much, if not more, than they did on October 6th. Its value has not diminished to them in the slightest. They want it. They need to see a credible commitment to that pathway to a two-state resolution, and more than just kilam farag, empty words. They need to see something meaningful there, but they want it because they need it for their own purposes, de-risking vis-a-vis the real threat, which isn't Israel or Hamas, it's Iran. The Emirates very much want to see stability. They want to see an end to the Islamist radical challenge that Hamas represents. That's been key to their own political viewpoint. Qatar wants a central role, and it has one, as it has so often had over these last decades, and has been an effective, critical interlocutor with Hamas for us, for Israel, throughout all of this. So, yeah, we talk with them all continuously.
All right, Ed, if you all give us about a few minutes, just to have such a credible, recently experienced expert, literally in the trenches until just a few weeks ago. I just want to ask two more questions that may kind of wrap things up. Just two questions I will combine because they're relatively similar and obviously confound a lot of people. One says, if there was a vote in Gaza today, would Hamas be reelected to run Gaza? And then related to that, someone asks, if Israel did agree to a credible path to a two-state solution, how could it be done in a way that Hamas could not take credit for it, and in essence, really just stay in power? I mean, they are the de facto authority, rightly or wrongly, in Gaza, and Netanyahu understandably says, I don't just want a military defeat, a destruction of Hamas, I want a political destruction of Hamas. What kind of day after leadership can there be in Gaza that does not involve Hamas, that Hamas would agree to any negotiation that calls for their destruction, basically their removal from power?
You can't make the pieces fit, Ronan. Yeah. You can't make the formula come to an answer. That's the struggle. Oh, I can be creative. Well, we need to do this. And there are things we do need to do. That articulation of a two-state vision is important. It is a framing vision, a political horizon which has to be out there. Whether it can be achieved now or at any predictable point in the immediate future, that's not the issue. It must be the frame. It must be the challenge, the counter idea to Hamas's very well evolved idea of what they see as the political future, not just of Palestinians, but of the Arab world as a whole. The replacement of fundamentally illegitimate secular governments with the only legitimate governance there is, classic Muslim Brotherhood inspired Islamist rule. But you got to have it out there, the two-state vision. Whether you believe it can be achieved, actually executed or not, you have to articulate it. Why would Hamas sign their own political death warrant? Well, they won't. They won't. They have to be in a position of such constraint that not that they can't oppose, but that their act of opposing is not sufficient to counter the forces in favor of a different direction. That's the challenge. It's getting to that point, given the complexities of the situation in Gaza right now.
And you discussed some of this, but maybe just to get into a broader sense of it. Lee asks, did Hamas calculate the scope of the attack to provoke what would be perceived as an overreaction within the international community? And I suppose related to that, just how do you think the dynamics have changed, say, in particular, say, with some of the European partners or European perspectives? You have, a few European nations now that have said they would approve of Palestinian representation in the United Nations. How has it changed beyond the U.S.'s view, other significant players in the world in terms of how they view the issue?
It's difficult to comment with any authority on what Hamas thought they were going to achieve. I suspect the actual outcome of October 7th surprised even them in the inability of Israel to keep them out and to respond to their being in, and in the number of hostages they were able to take and the number of Israelis killed. Did they intend to massacre? Absolutely. Yes, they did. No question at all about that, and that's not speculation or analysis. It's based on survivors from the attack, Hamas survivors and those picked up in Gaza after, explaining what they thought. Impact on the world at large, that's the attrition campaign. These are painful images to witness, very painful. And in some places, they have moved governments, Ireland, Spain, to a different position than before. They are not positions we agree with or believe are justified by international practice or on the basis of actual interest in advancing a peaceful resolution in the Middle East. But has it had an impact? Yes, it has. Is Sinwar aware of that? You bet he is.
And it's a difficult subject to try and end with a bit of a possible, bright spot. But maybe we can try, even if it's hopeful. I think, obviously, Yom Kippur War, a few years later, you have the Camp David Accords and kind of regional acceptance by the Jordanians and the Egyptians. You have the first Intifada, which the horrific nature of that was maybe part of why we're able to get to the Oslo Accords. I know it might be a long way off, but do you think this awful, 8, 9, 10 months or however much longer this will go on might be able to start some kind of a seed of a real long-term settlement and agreement between Palestinians and Israelis?
Not unless Hamas is rendered unable to continue to advance its own political vision. 31 years of opposition to, rejection of. All those things had happened from 77, Sadat's visit on. They're not going to change. It is who they are. It isn't a tactic. They think they're winning. They must be in a position where they're not going to be destroyed. Let's be realistic about that. But where what they are left as is not sufficient to fight a different vision, a different kind of day after. And that's what's different than 73. It's what's different than the evolution of the PLO in the time that preceded 93 and the Oslo Agreement. It's because the entity you're dealing with is fundamentally different. PLO had tried another terrorist approach. It had failed. It was collapsing. It had only one other way to go, which was fortunately in eschew of terror. Hamas thinks they're winning.
Well, that's as bright an ending as I think maybe we can have. But will you all please join me in thanking Ambassador David Satterfield. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronan.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.